Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delvo Rohaj and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friend,
Giselle Donnelly. I'm also a senior fellow at AEI.
colleague Julia Joja is away today. On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Siegfried Mureșan, a member of European Parliament from Romania and Vice President of the European People's Party. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Mr. Mureșan, it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. We hosted you for a little informal lunch at the Institute some weeks ago. And back then, like today, the event in Romania's wider neighborhood around the Black Sea obviously are at the forefront of people's minds. You are the chair of the EU-Moldova Parliamentary Association Committee, and you've been very much involved in trying to bring Moldova closer to the European orbit and help it integrate into Western political structures. I wonder if you could give us an update, because Moldova obviously, more than Ukraine now, is at the fault line, and I don't think Russia has quite given up yet on political influence and trying to sort of project soft power and trying to subvert the pro-Western leadership of the country. And I mean, since our lunch back in May, you've been to Moldova at least once. I wonder, what your most recent thoughts are on where the country is headed.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for putting this important topic on the agenda of our podcast today. The Republic of Moldova is a European country that is geographically located between the European Union and Ukraine. It is a country in which a pro European candidate won the last presidential elections 2.5 years ago against a pro Russian, pro Kremlin incumbent president. So, a young female president committed to the rule of law, committed to transatlantic values, committed to reforming and modernizing the country, winning against the incumbent pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian, backwards-oriented president is the type of development that we would all like to see in Belarus, and it proves so difficult, and in so many other places around the world. What happened in the Republic of Moldova was remarkable, and it is relevant beyond the borders of the country. This new president committed to organizing early parliamentary elections to finish once and for all with the untransparent majorities which used to govern the Republic of Moldova in recent years. Oligarchs controlling significant parts of the political landscape, of the business in the country, and also of the media used to operate with fragile majorities, non-transparent, politicians moving from one party to another so that they could keep control of the country. The result was that the country did not reform for years, did not make progress in its European integration process. Although the European Union was committed to support, the country was not fulfilling the commitments, and so support couldn't come. So this new president said, look, we need once and for all a transparent parliamentary majority. She committed to organizing early parliamentary elections, respected the promise. Elections took place in July 2021, and the pro-reform, pro-Western, pro-European party won a landslide victory, an absolute majority in the parliament, 63 out of 100 seats in the parliament. And this party has started reforming the country. So the country is being up. So there is a government which is transparently being supported by the pro-European party. Then, of course, the illegal, unprovoked, illegitimate invasion of Russian armed forces into Ukraine started. And in the first weeks of the war, Moldova was the country that received the highest influx of refugees compared to its population, higher than Poland, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Romania, higher than any other country in Europe. People acted in accordance to European values, human rights. Every Ukrainian citizen coming to Moldova was offered protection, safety, security, and their immediate needs were covered. Authorities as well acted in a way in which we were convinced at the level of transatlantic partners that this is a country really committed to becoming a reliable member of the Western world. We have also understood since the beginning of the war how important this country is for the security of Europe, for the security of all of us, including for the security of Ukraine. Simply because the country is geographically located between the European Union and Ukraine, we would all be in a much more difficult situation if, in addition to dictator Lukashenko in Belarus, Putin would have a pro-Russian regime governing the Republic of Moldova. So there is good news. There is willingness to reform, but there is also need for help. Of course, the country is about 3 million people, an economy which is 10% of the economy of a major European city. Take the city of Vienna, the city of Hamburg, the city of Barcelona in Spain. These cities alone, each of them produces 10 times more than the GDP of the Republic of Moldova. So it's a country with a tiny economy, which means that what is for us, for the United States, for the IMF, for Europe, small amounts of financial support can make a big difference on the ground. The country is working on reducing its dependency on Russia. 2 years ago, they were 100% dependent on Russian gas. Now they are interconnected through Romania to the European Union. With European support, they have developed capabilities of purchasing gas on the international markets and from other European countries. They are committed to reducing their dependency on Russia. People start understanding more and more that, Europe, United States, Great Britain are their friends and Russia is in fact just a threat. Last point, of course, which means that support for European integration is about 2/3 of the population. Support for NATO membership is much, much smaller because the country has the principle of neutrality written down in its constitution, and people are still committed to this. It's not up to us to tell them to give up their neutrality. They have this written in their constitution, but they understand that also in the area of security, a closer cooperation with NATO member states is something which provides more security to them. Last point, Russian disinformation, propaganda, still important, particularly because, as in the past, as I was explaining in the beginning, in the past, majorities in parliament were not transparent, were volatile. Whenever the country would become too ambitious in its European integration path, it was relatively easy for Russia to generate, governmental instability and to bring down a government through ordinary parliamentary procedures. But now we have one party which is pro-Western, which holds an absolute majority. It is united, and there is no way to bring down the pro-European government. And this is why the oligarchs, which are under time pressure because the reforms in the country have started, the reform of the judiciary has started. This is why oligarchs in the country, and they are under time pressure because they are being held accountable for what they did in the past. So this is why the oligarchs in the country, plus the Russian Federation, are trying to undermine the democratically elected government. They cannot do that in parliament, as I explained. They are trying to do it through different so-called protests, organizing protests, bringing people to the streets. But they haven't really succeeded for the past years. Numbers of people, even if as documented by international organizations, by civil society, numbers of people coming out and protesting in favor of Russia against the government was very, very small. And we have seen, for example, a significant rally in favor of the European integration of the Republic of Moldova, attended by more than 80,000 people 1 month ago. I was also there present. It was really inspiring. So we are seeing that Not every single citizen in Moldova wants European integration, but a vast majority of people do that.
I wonder if we could talk a bit about the domestic politics of all this. I mean, one of the things that we've seen where there has been democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, the sort of formula for that is power elite, or the oligarchs, or whatever you want to call them, sort of invoke nationalism as a way to rally support among rural voters versus urban voters. It's kind of not dissimilar from what one finds in the United States these days. I'm wondering if there's any of that dynamic that might be lurking in Moldova, and whether, again, over the course of time, particularly if the war continues for several years and the burden of the refugees remains, whether the kind of thing we've seen in Hungary, even to a certain degree in Slovakia, even Poland to a certain degree, could also play out in Southern Europe as well.
A word on refugees, and then, a complete answer on nationalism, which are both very legitimate questions. Refugees. First weeks of the war, between 500,000 and 600,000 people have crossed the border from Ukraine into Moldova. In total, it has been in the subsequent weeks about 1 million people. Very much for a country of not more than 3 million people living there. About 100,000 of these people are right now permanently based in the Republic of Moldova. There was a time in May, June last year when up to 15% of children in Moldovan schools were Ukrainian. Now the figure is less, it's about 10%, but still, that means that education, healthcare needs to adjust. Support at the level of population is significant. They feel for Ukrainian people. The president of the country, a prime minister. I met 2 days ago the speaker of parliament. They say, look, we do have difficulties, but the difficulties which people in Ukraine are facing are much, much bigger. So the fact that the authorities, the government, the president, they use their authority to explain to people that, yes, we do have to make sacrifices in the Republic of Moldova, but these are less than and smaller than, the shortcomings and the dangers that people in Ukraine are facing, this helps, and this keeps support at the level of population relatively high. Of course, the Republic of Moldova needs financial support to be able to economically and socially cope with this, because energy prices have increased 7 times last winter in comparison to 2 winters before. We do have inflation everywhere, but inflation in the Republic of Moldova was about 30% in August, November last year. It's going down now. It's projected to decrease to below 10%, become single digit by the end of this year. But what I'm trying to say is economically, the situation is not simple. This has social consequences. We need to support to be able to keep, also the support for the pro-Western government. So for the time being, people are committed to helping people of Ukraine, also because they are very close to the war and they see and understand what this means. Now your question on nationalism, which I think is fundamental. Firstly, the majority of people in the Republic of Moldova do speak Romanian as their mother tongue, as their first language. That means they do have access to information, to mass media, which is objective, which is credible, which is Western, which is, partly in Romanian language, but also the knowledge of foreign languages, English included in the country, is good. But there is a part of the population which is a minority, which is Russian speaking. And there, of course, it's much easier for the Russian Federation to disinform, to misuse the media tools, the media channels. Moldovan authorities have restricted, have limited the influence of Russian channels, Sputnik, but also others, Russian-speaking channels, which in fact were just disinforming, were dangerous, were restricted in the country. It's a decision that one doesn't make lightly, but it was needed, as those were clearly tools of disinformation propaganda. So what I'm trying to say is, particularly the Russian-speaking parts of the population, the less educated part of the population, the elderly, and living in the rural areas are the vulnerable categories of population. The capital city is, a vibrant European city. People informing themselves through various channels. Much harder to be misinformed. 80,000 people in favor of European integration in the capital city, of all ages, by the way, at this mass rally 1 month ago. So indeed, Moldova has to overcome the divide between the rural urban, the Russian and Romanian speaking, the elderly and the younger parts. The good thing is that it has a significant diaspora, people living abroad, Moldovan citizens, which, because they hold a Romanian passport, an EU passport, are working, living, traveling to Europe, are informing themselves, are therefore also communicating back home to their parents, to their families. Of course, that does not automatically mean that they change their point of view, and for sure not of everyone, and for sure not in the short term, but in the longer term, it does have an impact. The president of the country has managed to win with her party an absolute majority in the parliamentary elections by, although they are mainly a Romanian speaking party, also addressing the Russian electorate. And this is my important point. So we should not forget, the Russian speaking people, and we should not by default, blame the Russian speaking people for the fact that they are victims of disinformation and of propaganda. We should find ways to talk to them, to go into the rural areas. Ahead of the parliamentary elections, the president of the country started addressing them as well in Russian, and the main message was, irrespective of the language that we speak at home, some might speak Romanian, some might speak Russian as their first language, some Ukrainian, some Turkish, some Bulgarian, the dangers are the same. And the former corrupt political class is a threat to all of us, and corruption is making ordinary citizens poorer, irrespective of whether they speak Romanian or Russian back home. And this message resonated with a part of the Russian-speaking people, and it enabled the absolute majority for this pro-reform parties. So yes, this risk exists. We should address these people as well. We shouldn't forget about them. In addition to the very legitimate urban-rural divide which you were describing, there is also this linguistic division.
You haven't touched on the security dimension of the Moldovan situation all that much. Obviously, going back decades, Moldova is dealing with this situation, the self-styled breakaway region of Transnistria, and the presence of Russian so-called peacekeepers, and that has acted as a kind of festering wound on the body politic of Moldova, partly because of business interests that sort of extend from Transnistria into sort of Moldovan politics, and I think that sort of dynamic that you described with sort of oligarchs stepping on the brakes whenever the country got too fast in its sort of rapprochement with the European Union and Western political bodies, I think is apt. That said, there is no easy way of resolving this issue without some kind of direct confrontation with Russia. I mean, there are these Russian troops there. How do you get rid of them? Or is there a way of solving the problem that does not involve a sort of military solution to this?
Firstly, there is no immediate security threat to the Republic of Moldova deriving from the Russian Federation. Russia would like to, but they do not have the capabilities. They are losing in Ukraine, they're not winning, and as long as Ukrainian troops are keeping the Russians in the south and in the east far away, there is no immediate risk for the Republic of Moldova. In order for the Russian Federation to become an immediate threat to the Republic of Moldova, they would need to be able to build a bridge between their troops stationed now in the so-called Transnistrian region of Moldova and what they have in southern and eastern Ukraine, and Russia is not in the position of doing that. As long as Odessa and Nikolaev are not in Russian hand, they are under Ukrainian control. There is no way that Russians can get into Moldova, and we all know, particularly Odessa is a city that is very well protected meanwhile. So there is no immediate threat. The immediate risks that exist are disinformation, hybrid risks, hybrid threats. This is why the European Union has now created a special civil mission with about 50 experts in the area of cyber security, experts coming from more member states of the European Union, from European institutions that are being deployed to the Republic of Moldova to be able to tackle these hybrid threats much better. Then, of course, Wagner type of individuals are trying to cross the borders of the country. So far, Moldovan authorities are managing to keep them away, but they have to be very, very alert. Likewise, there was a clearly pro-Russian party in the country led by a convicted fugitive. The party was declared unconstitutional last week, but they were trying to also recruit people that were ready to commit acts of violence. So this is why the authorities have to be very, very careful so that, a security threat from inside the country, with the support of Wagner type of movements does not really evolve. Then, of course, security threats to the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, and Europe are in many areas, common. Risk of smuggling, human trafficking, smuggling drugs from Asian countries, eventually trying to smuggle the weapons that exist in Ukraine. So these security threats exist. They are common to Europe and Moldova. Very often, Europe is the final target for these types of smugglings, and Moldova is at most a transit country. So we have understood this recently, and this is why we have strengthened cooperation. The European Union has also launched a so-called security hub in Moldova with European expertise, financial support to have Ukrainian, Moldovan, EU authorities and authorities of EU member states better cooperate in better tackling the regional security threats and challenges. Of course, Russia does have troops and ammunition in the so-called Transnistrian region. We do not know exactly what condition that weapons are in. International missions were not allowed to inspect those weapons for about 20 years. We do not know whether they pose a risk or a threat. It is clear that the resolution of this frozen conflict will depend on the resolution of the situation in Ukraine. The best that we can, and it's also clear that there is no immediate solution. A good solution is a well thought and well prepared solution, but not a quick fix. This is why the most important thing right now is that in the Transnistrian region, people do not respond to any types of provocations. And the most important thing right now is that there is no provocation in the region. And the good thing is that since the start of the war, we have seen the situation being calm, no escalation, no provocation. And that's really the most that we can hope for right now. The truth is that on both sides of the Nistru River, people want to live in peace at the end of the day. Of course, Russians are trying to influence, people in the so-called Transnistrian region. But so far, the situation is stable, and that's the most important thing in the short term. The rest we will deal with in the longer term. What is very important is that Moldova's European integration, which is possible in so many other areas, is not being held back because of the yet unresolved frozen conflict. We can progress in modernizing Moldova, in reforming its public administration, its judiciary, in strengthening its economy, in reducing its energy dependency from Russia, even before we solve the Transnistrian conflict.
I have a bold suggestion that we actually talk about Romania a bit before we conclude. Siegfried, it seems to me, as a amateur and outsider, that there does seem to have been renewed energy in these, for want of a better term, Western orientation of Romania. I think particularly on the security front. There was a call the other day for the Germans to step up their troop presence in Romania. There's been progress on F-16 fighter jet sales. And even possibly more stunning, it seems to me, and I appreciate your take on this, progress on the EU front. There's renewed discussion of Schengen zone accession, I guess is the right term.
Especially in the light of what's been happening politically. So there have been at least 3 different prime ministers over the course of the past month. So if you could sort of give us a primer in sort of Romanian politics, that would be really helpful.
With pleasure. So look, we have always seen our membership in the European Union as a premise for our prosperity, as the most important pillar of our prosperity. And we have always seen the membership in NATO and the partnership that we do have with the United States as the most important guarantees for our security. So we are fully committed, to further integrating our capabilities with those of other NATO member states. We are happy to be hosting troops, colleagues, soldiers from several other member states of NATO in Romania. We are very happy to also have some defense capabilities organized together with our American partners in Romania, which we feel make Romania safer and make NATO and the region as a whole safer. So, and this honestly is a topic that the main parties in the country would never disagree on. These fundamentals, and this is why, in terms of security, ever since we joined NATO in 2004, almost 20 years ago, even in the more difficult situations the alliance was in, we were always committed to be there, to help, to also play a role internationally and try to resolve conflicts, be it in Iraq, Afghanistan, or in Western Balkan countries, or sometimes also in African countries. So we are there, count on us. We are investing to further modernize, better equip our troops in that context also. F-16s, and of course, the day will come when we will want to move to the next generation F-35s, but that is still a bit complicated, a bit expensive for us. But in terms of investments into F-16s, that's where we clearly are moving. Now, politically, the country is being governed by a grand coalition of the two largest parties in the country. My party, a center-right, Liberal Party, and a social democratic center-left party. These parties used to be at odds in the past, particularly because the socialists were not very committed to the fight against corruption in the past. They were challenging the rule of law, and they were sometimes also weakening the independence of the judiciary. For the time being, my party and that socialist party are in government together because there is no alternative to this grand coalition. Mathematically and politically, the good thing about this grand coalition is the stability that it has brought over the course of the last 2 years. It started almost 2 years ago. There is parliamentary stability, there is predictability, and particularly in times of war at your border, this form of stability is not a small thing. It's important. It has allowed us to help Ukraine to be able to mobilize support for more than 2 million Ukrainian refugees crossing our borders relatively fast. So we do not love the socialists. I guess they also do not love us. But the fact that they are inside the tent somehow makes the tent more stable. Had they been outside, had we been governing alone, times of war, there might have been, higher risk that they challenge our course on supporting Ukraine and so on. So this is where we are, and because the two parties are about equal in size, when we negotiated this government 1.5 years ago, the deal was that the president of the center-right Liberal Party, my party, is prime minister for the first 1.5 years, and then 1.5 years later, the president of the Socialist Party takes over. This rotation happened about 2 weeks ago, exactly as planned, which shows that indeed the construction is stable. But of course, what a center right and the center left party want in the long term sometimes differs. This means that the country is being governed in a stable way. That's good, but it's harder to do fundamental reforms simply because the center right and the center left party might have different visions. But then the good thing is that immediately after COVID, at the European level, we have decided to launch the biggest package of economic support ever in Europe, about 750 billion euros for EU member states, out of which about 30 billion euros for Romania. And we are putting these amounts from the European level at the disposal of member states for investments, but in exchange for commitments for reforms. So countries absolutely have to reform in order to be able to access those money from the post-COVID recovery fund, money which are available until 2026. So although socialists might have a different view on reforms than we have, in order to access these important amounts, we have committed to several fundamental reforms, labor market, pension system reforms, reforms of public administration, further digitizing the economy, reducing energy dependency on Russia, improving energy efficiency, transitioning to green energy. And these are all commitments that we have made. And like it or not, two parties in government have to do it. This is a bit where we are. Last point, Schengen, you asked me about it, very important to us. Romania has been fulfilling all of the technical requirements to join the Schengen area since 2011. And the final decision, a political decision, needs to be made by all member states of the European Union unanimously to allow us to join. Everyone recognized that we were fulfilling the technical criteria, but there were concerns with regards to the stability of the rule of law in our country in those times, as I was explaining before, when socialists were in government. In November of last year, the European Commission, in its yearly monitoring of the judiciary in Romania, they said that Romania has fulfilled all of their commitments towards strengthening the rule of law, improving the independence of the judiciary, and they say the situation in our country is in no ways worse than in other EU member states. And this has played a role in the eyes of other EU member states. It has played a role together with the fact that they saw that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, under the most difficult conditions, we could secure an external border of the European Union. We processed all people properly. We knew exactly who crossed, when, and so on from Ukraine. So we gained credibility because of the way in which we managed an external border. We managed to lift the concerns of several EU member states with regards to the rule of law in Romania, and the European Commission has confirmed again that we are fulfilling all technical requirements. That led us to the point where 26 out of 27 member states in the European Union said we fulfill the conditions, we should join. One single country, Austria, said they vetoed this, which means that yes, we are closer to joining the Schengen area, but it has not yet happened because of Austria's veto. Austria is under significant migration pressures, which do not come from Romania and have nothing to do with Romania. People coming into Austria are coming via Hungary, via Serbia, and originally from India, Indonesia, Northern Africa, like Tunisia, or also other Asian countries like Bangladesh. They came because these countries have liberalized their visa regime because Serbia has liberalized their visa regimes with these countries. people were flying into Serbia easily, then crossing Hungary straight into Austria. So yes, Austria has a problem with migration, but the people who are seeking asylum in Austria are not coming from Romania, and they were not coming through Romania. We are now working with the European Union to make sure that this migratory flow is better managed. Although we are not the source of Austria's problems, we are of course ready to help overcome it, and we hope that as the migration issue will be better managed in Austria, the government will make a reasonable decision to support our accession. So we feel we are close to joining the Schengen area. We feel support is big, but it needs to be unanimous, and we are not yet there.
We have to do an episode on Austria one day, on the role that this country has played in Central and Eastern Europe over the past 20 years. From the money laundering to just being, generally unhelpful in the current situation. And the fact that, they've been able to get away with that in a way, others haven't. The country that managed to convince the world that Mozart was Austrian and Hitler was German. But let's leave that for another time. So before we let you go, I want to ask you a wider European question. So, we hear a lot about European strategic autonomy, about Europe's ability to address geopolitical challenges on its own. At some fundamental level, that might just mean that Europeans need to sort of step up and do more and spend more on defense, spend more on, responding to sort of, real-time geopolitical events. The question is whether, to what extent the EU itself is an effective platform to do that. You've been involved in negotiations over the EU budget in the past at many different junctures. That, two things about the European budget that I think American listeners need to know. One, that it's A, relatively small compared to national budgets, and B, that it is framed within a 7-year horizon, which makes it somewhat difficult for it to actually respond to sort of real-time developments. When the recovery and resilience facility was designed during the time of COVID, very few people could have thought of this war that was coming in 2022. So how do you see the EU sort of adapting and sort of changing this fundamental fiscal toolbox in response to really a sort of world that seems to be changing at a very rapid pace, and that also requires the EU to respond accordingly?
Look, the budget is one of the most important policy tools that you have, right? It's the same at national level, at level of states, at regional, local level. It's the same at EU level. Reality in Europe is that member states are spending most at national level. They are collecting taxes at national level, and they are deciding nationally how to spend that. Just about 1% of Europe's GDP is being spent at EU level, primarily in areas where it makes sense to spend together. Security and defense was an area where member states have said, because of their national sovereignty, they make decisions nationally. But meanwhile, they see that it makes sense to pool their efforts together at European level, particularly when it comes to purchases of equipment, investments in military industry, in research, innovation in this area. It makes sense to pull your efforts together at European level, spend once, invest once, and have the cheapest access to the most modern equipment. The armies of EU member states together use so many more types of weapons than the US army does. This makes them inefficient. So, although NATO is the primary military alliance in Europe, at EU level, we can do more in defense, in acquisition of ammunition, and so on, and we are doing this. You've asked me about the EU budget and how does it cope with this. Look, yes, the EU budget is planned for a 7-year period, and it uses to be planned in a way in which it is sufficient for Europe's day-to-day expenditures, for supporting farmers, supporting students going on a scholarship in another European country, supporting excellence programs in the area of research innovation, but it has proven to be insufficient to cope to cope with unexpected developments like COVID or like the war in Ukraine. So we are right now negotiating a so-called revision of this 7-year multi-annual financial framework. We understood we have to react. We are revising this, making the appropriations more flexible, allowing money to be used where it is needed, simpler rules, less rules, so more flexibility, and also at the end of the day, a moderate increase of the budget as a whole, including to be able to support Ukraine. So we are about to decide to allocate 50 billion euros additionally to Ukraine for the next 4 years, so about 12 billion euros per year, in addition to everything that we have committed so far. So for the next 4 years, we are about to decide now to allocate 50 billion euros more to Ukraine in the context of this revision of Europe's budget. And I think this is good. I believe that supporting Ukraine needs to remain an international effort. But I believe that also due to geographical proximity with the European Union, should not find ourselves in a situation in which other parts of the world are doing more for Ukraine than we are. And for the time being, what Europe is doing overall, receiving 8 million refugees, which was a huge effort, significant costs, including in local communities, 11 waves of sanctions against Russia, the military support, which was slow in the beginning, but it's much quicker now, the financial support, I believe it adds up to a significant amount, and we are committed to doing that for the long term, for as much as it is needed, and be very open, transparent about it, and plan it long in advance so that everyone knows that we are committed, and so that Ukraine knows as well that we are committed. We also know we have to reduce our dependency on countries that we cannot trust. It was a political mistake to be so dependent on Russian fossil fuels. We are reducing our dependency there. We have reduced by more than 80% our dependency on Russian gas within less than 2 years. We should also learn and be sure that never again in the future we become dependent on one country of origin, route of transport, or source of energy in the future. This is why also when it comes to our policy on China, we do not need to economically decouple from China. This might be difficult, but we need to de-risk, and that is our priority. Reduce the risks for ourselves, and this is what we understand when we talk about strategic autonomy. Reduce the risks that would derive from China, which, though an economic partner, is a country led by a regime which believes in something fundamentally different than what we believe in.
Thank you, Siegfried Muresan, for taking the time to speak to us. From Dalibor Rohaj
and Giselle Donnelly,
thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag EasternFrontPod, written as one word. And don't forget to sign up for the Eastern Front's newsletter through the link included in the show notes to receive more content from the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. It helps others find the show. Thank you, and goodbye.